to get started, I know that Adam talked about in the intro. We're talking about two things here, like AI and automation. I think Brandon, you had like a good framework for how you think about those two. So maybe we can start with like you sharing that to set the stage in some way.
Yeah, for sure. I know we started talking about AI and automation and having that be part of this conversation, but I see it as two different things really. It's and sort of in this finance realm, I see it as a Venn diagram. And so yeah, AI and automation are the two circles that exist, and overlapping those practices, is where maybe some of the superpowers come from. So yeah, you can have AI without automation. You've got your LLMs that I think most people are at least familiar with at this point. And then automation that exists without AI, Aleph a couple months ago, may have been an example of that. And like I said, that Venn diagram of overlap is where I think, this next generation of tooling is really going to create superpowers within finance.
It makes a lot of sense. And finance people love frameworks. So when you mention Venn diagram, you already have the attention of the public here, which is great. And I think that's a helpful framing of, yes, we're going to talk about like the latest and greatest that we're seeing in AI and all the things that we're excited in the next, 5 years in the quest to AGI. A lot of finance teams feel closer today to, the Stone Age than the post, artificial general intelligence world. So let's start with automation and, how are you thinking about adding automation to your businesses, like things that you have done in the past or in the recent past? Maybe starting with you again, Brandon.
Yeah, I think we've all been there, particularly those of us who have gray hairs in their beard, of like going into all of our systems and pulling down the Excel exports and having these awesome macros created in some master Excel workbook and creating an output. But automation has moved us forward quite a bit. I was on a podcast a few weeks ago, and the thing that drove the most conversation afterwards, at least directly towards me, was the practice that we have at 2X of weekly reporting. And I've had this discussion with other CFOs as well. And a lot of times their face goes white when I say I report weekly, but it's automation that enables that. And the reason that I kind of got here is when I think about what reporting might look like in a year, standing from January 1st. If you're on a monthly reporting cadence, you're closing your first set of books in January. The first report that you're looking at is in mid-February. And if you did a good budget, like you're probably not meaningfully off of that. And it's the first time that you're looking at numbers and like, maybe something doesn't jump out. And so you say like, hey, let's see how this plays out till the next report. Now you're closing your February books and you're not looking at it until like mid-March, and you're having like that oh no moment of something's really going awry. And now you're 20% of the way through the year already. And by the time you gather all the right firefighters and put action plans in place and start to turn the ship a little bit, maybe you're into April, and that's just way too long for hypergrowth businesses and rapidly moving businesses, to really make the changes that need to be made. And so we operate on a weekly cadence, and I've sort of always had this thought that if you're on a voyage across the ocean and you can touch the wheel 52 times or 12 times, like touching it 52 times is probably going to give you a greater likelihood of success of landing where you want to land. And so that's what we've sort of brought forward as an operating model here. And now the rub on that is that it can't take an entire day to do your reporting. Like if you're doing weekly reports with an entire day dedicated to like gathering all the data and validating the inputs and cleansing and all that kind of stuff, like that's going to make you a super inefficient finance team. Too much on the backward looking, not enough on the forward looking. And so it has to be quick. And the only way to really do that is with automation and effective automation. So for us, that's API all of our data into a consolidated table, which we use Aleph for, and then having live reporting in Excel, particularly dashboards that leverage all the dynamic functions, to update instantly. And so that's how we sort of run automation here. I think some of the greatest value that I provided to the org here at 2X is kind of spotting the molehills before they become mountains, and having that weekly automated dashboard cadence has been the game changer and being able to do that, and for eliminating surprise with our exec team and our board, which is sort of a key tenet that you should have as a CFO.
And I imagine, Brandon, there's also something about like picking what are the things that make sense to measure weekly, right? And not let like the perfect be the enemy of what you can do. And like, maybe there are some things that you don't have the perfect automation to like measure end to end, but you can measure pretty much like, 80, 90% of the things that matter.
Yeah, it's the things that matter. That's the key point. Yeah, when I hear the term KPI, and people sort of use that as like, colloquially as metrics, they forget the K part, which is the key. And you get these 100-page dashboards and metrics that sort of all blend together. And so it's really having your finger on the pulse of the things that matter, and automating those things.
Nice. Johnny, how you think about like automation? I know like rules works with a lot of different customers, and so when you have one business to take care of, automation is important. When you have like hundreds, like automation is maybe even more important.
Yeah, well, I think so. That obviously, there's automation then on the actual handling of the finances for a single business, and then there's automation on managing a whole portfolio of clients, and that's where we've obviously got some different requirements, the kind of thing that Brandon's working with. I think that and not to give you a plug sort of this early in the conversation, but I'll go ahead. I think when in identifying opportunities for automation, you're doing things over the course of the day, just like Brandon was describing, where you almost like you just don't look forward to them because they're menial, they take up time, and they add very little value, but you know that you need them done right. And the thing that triggered for me the value in the Aleph platform was when you have that, I mean, really literally updating a module with actuals, getting information from the ledger, the different systems into a model reliably is the kind of thing that just takes time to do. But you want it done correctly. And I think when I saw the first time how Aleph essentially automates that, and there's no AI necessarily in that at all, but it creates like a workflow for you where you get one piece of the job done very quickly. And it alleviates, and from our standpoint, if you can alleviate time from low value add tasks, you create time for high value add tasks. And that's really important in a service environment. I think, Brandon, you mentioned the kind of similarity of finance team as a service team, like it needs to add value. And so I think when you release value for that, I think it's really important. I think one of the interesting things about the industry is, and I had this from a VC partner who said that she was very surprised at how QuickBooks hadn't managed to automate a great deal yet. And somebody else had said that, and I think this goes to some of the incumbent platforms there right now, that in the short term, they're not necessarily maybe that interested in automating because a lot of their business is made up from people who build time on that platform. And you've got this kind of, it's counterintuitive or it's kind of conflict in a way. Now, I think obviously that they can't exist there forever, but there has definitely been a slower rate of progress towards automation in some of the platforms than you would have expected. And so I think to the points that we'll make here, there are going to be platforms like Aleph that come in and just basically surpass what you can do with existing, and you're going to win a lot of market share and opportunity as a result.
Yes. And I think like, in both of your cases, of course, you're Aleph customers. So like, I know the answer at least on part, but like, how do you all think about the build versus buy dilemma on automation? I think like the first very important part is there's a problem to be solved. There's something that I want to automate. There's something that feels more manual than it should be, takes more time, takes more steps. But then there's always, part of why I started Aleph is because I was doing all of those things manually before. And for me, it was writing Visual Basic scripts and like in Excel files and, stitching things together. So maybe starting with you, Johnny, and then we can talk Brandon as well. Like, how do you think about when is the best alternative to just, build a more automated spreadsheet versus when might be better to look outside and like partner with someone?
Yeah, I mean, I think for in a service business, what's really important is that we keep rigorous, reliable quality of service for the clients, and so we have to be confident about what we're bringing to client service, and so it really does push us towards a buy mentality much more so. And then there's definitely build elements you can put in around that, because I think, with some of the AI that's coming out right now, it makes it possible to build certain glue components that kind of link things together. I'll come back to that. But I think the buy thing is very much at the forefront for us, and picking best in class platforms and tech, that basically creating a tech stack that makes us differentiated in the market. And that's across all sectors of the workflow, for definite. So I think, we err more on that buy side because we've got this sort of plethora of different businesses that we work with. I think when it comes to the build, I mean, the thing that I've experienced just in using some of the AI models to do script generation and coding and whatnot, is it's very easy to generate something for a specific use case, because you've got one particular task that you want to go and do. It can spit out code or perhaps even an application. You can use it, and it's great. But the assumption that it will work for various different edge cases is just not safe. And it takes, if you've got an app that you generate and you hand it off to somebody else, they're not entirely sure that they know exactly how it's going to get used. And then you also have to maintain it. And so that whole infrastructure around supporting a build function, I think, is something that's beyond quite a lot of companies. And you'd really have to invest in that software development expertise and management expertise, which is not incumbent in certainly in client service companies right now. So for those reasons, I think we're much more buy than build.
Yeah, it's always very, interesting, attractive. You open a blank spreadsheet, you're automating a process. The headache comes when like 3 months later, you want to open that spreadsheet again and say like, oh, okay, like let me just use this thing that I built a few months ago and
can like remember
and use it again. And I'm like, who built this, crap spreadsheet? Like, who built this? And like all of these errors that I'm seeing there. So there's definitely something there. Brandon, how do you think about it? Your whole business is about like, people choosing to buy instead of like have in-house right on their end. So how do you think for that yourself as leading the finance organization?
Yeah, I think being a CFO that grew up in FP&A, I have two orientations. Yeah, the CFO piece is to be cost conscious. And so there's a little bit of like, maybe I should try to build something first before I buy it. And then the FP&A piece of just being a builder and, connecting those dots. And yeah, that's the enjoyable part of my job is doing the FP&A piece and building models and all that kind of stuff. That's, I enjoy when my day's building that, not some of the other parts of the job. But I think, building at this point, is interesting. And it at least gives you, a foundation of the data and what you're trying to do. I think LLMs have started to level us up a bit in being able to do that. We've talked about that through the first 15 years of my career. I had to learn macros. I had to learn VBA. I tried to learn SQL. Didn't go great. We always had to sort of adapt towards knowing the platforms and knowing the language that the computer worked in, and that's changing now. The computer, being AI, is now learning how to interpret natural language and execute what we want to. And so I've gone in and said, hey, I want to build this the speedometer graph, and I knew how to do it 10 years ago, but I hadn't built one since. And like here's and tell me how to do it, and it built me a macro that built me a beautiful speedometer graph. And so there's certain leveling up that you can do with build, but I also think at the rate of acceleration that automation and AI have right now, if CFOs aren't dipping their toes in the water and starting to understand that and playing around with some of the tools, they're going to get left behind. Well, I'm sure we'll talk about the tools and the future landscape at some point, but I think things are changing really quickly here. And if folks aren't educating themselves and getting some experience with what's out there, then they're going to be in trouble.
And going a little bit of like a segue there of the automation into AI. In some way, my mental model is automation will take you quite far. And again, there's a lot of people that are doing a lot of like manual processes that like probably feel crazy to themselves in 2025. So I think there's the 0 to 1 automation, and I think the power of AI, or at least the promise of AI, is the 1 to 10, and how can you go from like that 1x to 10x in automation? How do you think, Brandon, about where do I need the basics and where do I just need something that I'm not doing data entry, and where should I invest more and like try to get that 10x and get the latest and greatest and like use AI?
Yeah, to me, I think if you look at the life cycle of your data, the action that happens somewhere to how that gets into your GL and the debits and credits, and then how that ends up in a KPI somewhere, and then how that ends up in an analysis or a forecast or something that drives action within the business. Looking at that whole life cycle, sort of start to finish, and identifying where the biggest pain points are. Like, where does everybody hate operating? Where am I always finding, the errors? Wherever those bottlenecks and pain points are in that, for lack of a better term, supply chain of a data point. That's where I think, the prime piece of investment goes first.
Yes. Johnny, I know that you all at Ruled are almost like in the mindset of let's automate everything, and a lot of it is partnering with companies like Aleph. I think we have a webinar later this month with another fellow Ruled vendor that is Tabs.
Yeah.
How do you think yourself about like where to automate and where there's opportunity?
Well, I think what you see with when there's a platform that comes to market that kind of fits or solves or targets a specific piece of the workflow, then you see them start to embed components of automation. So they look at certain pieces of a workflow or processes, and they kind of target that and make sure that that works reliably. And I think that's the kind of context for finance that differs for a lot of other users of AI or automation as such, is that we need things to reconcile. We need things to tie out. We need it to be consistent and rigorous. And I think that's where in other domains, I think you've got a lot more flexibility. I mean, even to use something like software development, the adage, if it compiles, it works. Like, it's not really, if you get an answer in finance, it's not necessarily the right answer. And you kind of need to tie that back. And so I think the platforms that kind of provide that, if I could call it some kind of framework or environment around a automation piece that validates what that automation is doing, then you're in a world where you've got successful output, and I think you build trust on a finance and accounting staff side. And I think that's certainly for our domain and our business, like that's absolutely critical. Like, we need to know that the answer that we put in is kind of what we expected, and we can trust that coming out. And so a lot of attention should be paid there, I think. And we're seeing it from the right kind of partners, yourself, and then obviously Tabs as well. I mean, we've seen their AI functions in action as well, and they've paid attention to the right pieces, which is just fantastic.
Yeah, no, and I totally hear that. And I think myself on my hat, wearing the product hat and leading the product organization still at LF, that's one of the biggest challenges, right? Because it is very easy to slap ChatGPT on a process, and like in 1 hour of an engineer, we can like make something that looks very pretty and like attractive in a demo. And then that's the 1% of the effort, and the 99% is where when you're doing an audit a few months down the line, how can you justify what you did, and how can you trace the AI? So yeah, like there's a big gap there.
Yeah, and one of the team actually described it the best, that these automation or AI sort of applications have to hit a sweet spot between the amount of time saving has to be more than it would otherwise. If you have to spend time correcting what the application has done, and that time ends up being more than otherwise doing just it manually, then you're in the wrong space. Like, you have to do something reliably enough so that we don't spend overall more time on it. And that's a critical sort of validity check, if you like.
And Johnny, I'm gonna ask you the same question, Brandon, in a second, but like we've been teasing AI, and we've been like talking around it for a bit now. Today, March 2025, what do we think is effective AI automation today? And we can then talk about, this is a space that's always evolving, but where do you see finance teams using AI today?
Well, I mean, I think, so let me say on two levels. I think that there's what are individual people doing? And, we talked about this before, that, there's lots of utility of AI, I think, in any person's daily activities, that they can use AI to summarize articles and contracts and whatever for the purpose of reading them and so on. And I think, and we talked about this before, that there's a guy, Ethan Mullick, who wrote a book called, I think it's Co-Intelligence. And he's he's a Wharton professor, and he talks it's very accessible reading, and it encourages, like, people should just be out there using these LLMs. They should get used to the kind of nature of prompting, because LLMs are around and they're going to stay, and they're only going to grow in our sort of daily, experience. And you've got to get to this point where you understand or feel much more familiar with what it's like to prompt an LLM, and then how it results in a kind of output. And I think that, if you spend the time yourself getting familiar with that, it makes the experience of using the AI applications that come out in platforms more intuitive, because you kind of understand a little bit more about what it's trying to do or why you ended up with where it was. And I think that's a particular key thing. the AI right now, I'd say it does go back to, certain platforms that we trust. I think, some of the stuff that you guys are doing, Albert, with Aleph is really compelling because you've established, as Brandon mentioned, like this data structure warehouse framework that you can rely upon, and intimately that all the data is out of QBO or any other kind of like data system. It's in there and you can rely upon it. And then you create AI functions around that exist within like and can be fact checked and validated. And that there means that the AI is working inside a constrained sort of rigorous environment that you can much more easily rely upon its output. I've not said that very well, but that's, I think Aleph creates like a very natural place to actually experiment and to deliver AI functions very easily.
Yeah, but I think you touched, Johnny, something that is true, that, finance has been slower than most to adopt AI. I think like part is the need for verifying the output that you're mentioning. Part is just that LLMs are not that great at math, and like they're much better at, legal and like, reviewing text than they are at math, which is something that, we as teams developing here in this space need to work around. Brandon, how are you using it yourself at your end? What are some of the things that you're, working with AI the most today, or seeing other teams?
For us, and as far as like folks that I'm talking to, I don't think, and I think Johnny kind of made this point, I don't think teams are using AI well today in the finance org. I think, individuals are using it for independent acts of AI in a vacuum. And then that's kind of how we use it right now. And so like, legal, contracts, I did really well on my SATs in math, not so much in language. And so like, reading through contract is brutal. And particularly like M&A. If you're a CFO and you haven't been through an M&A transaction yet, it's terrifying to see an equity purchase agreement that's probably 70 pages long, and the 30 or 40 red line events that go back and forth, and understanding all the heretofores and the therebys and all the legalese. Like being able to actually use a large language model to put it in a layman's term, like as a CFO, what are my responsibilities? What am I signing up for? What do I need to execute on the back end of this thing? Cuts down days and days of reading. I think about like email creation and communication, collections as an example. Every collection story has some different element to it. I didn't use this feature. The person that signed this isn't here anymore. Whatever the excuse du jour is, and putting that context into a large language model and having them, almost be a conversation partner on, how can we get through this, the quickest and most efficient and effective way. That's sort of where I think, finance teams are right now, is sort of that those random acts of AI. The next level, and what I think we all need to be thinking about is, that team version. And I don't know that there's probably a board meeting across the country that isn't talking about AI in some world. And so, I think finance teams, we need to be thinking about how we adapt that in the next year or two to make sure that we're not falling behind.
Yeah, no, and I think I probably speak with more finance teams. I mean, like more than you, Brandon, maybe not like more than you, Johnny, but like I do think that it is the topic of every quarterly meeting that I have with our customers, and I think the first reaction is everyone feels that it's behind, and it means that they are not behind. It's just the entire industry is behind where they should be, or where they want to be, and I think that's where for us, yes, there is like the flashy demos, and there's asking ChatGPT to put together your next board meeting like scenario, and I think like eventually that will come, and a lot of it today is what are the small things that are like very simple, but that AI can do very, very well. And a lot of the more exciting use cases in some way are cleaning vendor data and being able to extract from credit card transactions the vendor, so you can have like a proper trended like expenses by vendor view. And it does feel a little bit like you're killing mosquitoes with a bazooka, and you're like using this, using like the tool that's going to take us to, AGI, and using it to, okay, here's my credit card transaction that is like slightly off. But it is it is valuable, because like, I think in some way I do see almost all of these features are as building on top of one another, and having that clean, organized data, is the stepping stone for what's to come as well. So I think it makes a lot of sense. And by the way, I'm not seeing any comments yet. We're gonna have like Q&A in a bit, but if anyone has any comments about what we're talking, we're also happy to take some questions and interact with you all throughout. One of the things I wanted to, I was talking about how every finance team feels it's behind where they want to be. What do you think is, why is that, and what are some of the challenges? I think like Johnny, you were talking a bit about, trust and how can we verify them. What are some of the other things where, you think people are not adopting AI as much as at the team level, not just at the individual level?
Well, I think companies like us, you've got to pay attention to continuing service quality. So you have to make sure that whatever implementation you're doing is not detracting from, ongoing top level world-class type service to the client base. So you can't have like kind of experience this kind of disruption or lack of quality, etc. So I think that's one thing. And you need, I think in companies like us, like a real buy-in to this trajectory that the industry is on, the marketplace, of going much more towards a technology platform enabled accounting world. And when you've got sort of the leadership and frankly the companies actually bought in intellectually and conceptually to this being the right path to follow, then you've got the right openness of mind and people to start trialing things, to try platforms out, to be positive about things. When it doesn't work out quite as intended, let's go and give it another shot. Like, how are we actually going to take this that we've chosen to be the right environment to work in? How are we going to make it actually do what we need it to do? And that, that's not, it's not a single track, sort of no side roads or, diversions or whatever process. Like, you have to work your way through it. And I think of course, there are companies in our space, I think, who are much more progressive than others. We like to think that Rolled is right there at the forefront. Like, we want to be part of this adoption of technology. I think we've seen the last 5-7 years an enormous increase in investment in accounting and finance type technology. Not only AI enabled, but it was happening before AI came along in its current frame. So I think it is about mindset, and it's about sort of, bringing people, everybody along together. And I think that's going to matter no matter whether you're a company like us with 50 people or whether you're, Brandon or team with like 5 people. You've got to bring everybody along collectively. And I think that training element, familiarity, and helping, ensure all the way that people feel that they're getting the right benefit and results from the platform. I keep going back to the validity, because I think that's like it's where trust comes from. And you need that for people to then go and represent that answer in front of clients.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. And while you're talking, Johnny, there was like a survey coming on, and like the results of 80% of attendees think that like AI will change entire workflows, major transformation of entire workflows. So I think like clearly the mindset is there, and like people are waiting, and there is a bit of what you're saying of, in the end, there's the change management. They need to be open to it, and LLMs will make mistakes. And I think like, going through that and accepting that it's a journey, not like a flip that you switch and then like all of your problems are solved overnight, or although it's pretty close to that in some cases. I think it's very, very valid.
Yeah, exactly.
Brandon, how do you think about it?
Yeah, I think it's trust and noise in the market. Trust being a little bit what you guys have talked about already on, it's not perfect yet, particularly on the large language models. I remember the first time I saw hallucination in real time. I'd seen this term in the market, like AI hallucinations, and I didn't really know what it meant. The first time I saw it, I was like, whoa, like I was doing some, analysis of adjacent companies to ours, and some of them are publicly traded. And so I tried to do the LLM thing of, hey, go out to their 10K, pull me these, these risk assessments and all that kind of stuff. And I was like, ooh, that's a good one. Let me go to the 10K and screenshot that so I can put that in a deck. And I went to the 10K and the language wasn't there. Not only that, the page number reference wasn't there. It was like page 60 of a 50-page doc. I was like, whoa, it really sort of made me reassess how I think about LLMs and AI and where we're at on that. Because, had I not sort of source check that, I would have looked like a fool in a board meeting. And so I think trust is certainly an element of, this thing is not perfect yet. And if I'm going to be putting my financial data through there, trusting the output and having my people, sort of trust the output and be totally reliant on that, that would make me nervous as a CFO. The other piece is noise. There's so much noise in the market. We're in professional services, and we joke around here all the time that if somebody in your office uses a computer, you're a tech-enabled service, because everybody wants to be a tech-enabled service. And I think we're sort of in that place with AI right now. Like, everybody wants to be an AI tool or have AI enablement, and there's so much noise in there that I think it's a big effort, especially because it's so nascent, and we are still in the early innings of it, to sort of realize, like, what is really AI native platform? What does it look like? What are the real players out there versus someone that's just kind of doing this Frankenstein bolt on of putting an LLM on one piece of their technology, and now we're an AI enabled tool. And so if I'm making a big capital investment in AI technology, like, I want to make sure that I'm making bets on the right horses. And that could be where I see people being a little bit gun shy right now.
Yes, makes sense. And I think, like, the other side of that promise of AI, which I know the way that I think about it in our business is very important, is AI also cuts down how it is to implement software and even show value. So it should be one where you shouldn't need to take someone for granted on, is like this AI going to work or not. And I think, like, one of my predictions is, like, especially in AI, like, POCs should become more common. I think there's a lot of discussions around, like, usage-based pricing that I think, like, it's very interesting. Or like, what's the price of AI if you don't use it, like, should be zero. And, like, I think, like, vendors should be comfortable with that, and, like, that's the best way to align incentives in some way. So yeah. We have a question coming up that I promise we didn't place ourselves, but at the same time, we don't want to do a lot of, like, self-promotion. We want to keep it on topic, but it's a question about, we'd love to hear Johnny and Brandon talk about their experiences with implementing Aleph. How long, major challenges, how was the learning curve? So yeah, any highlights for Dante here in the audience?
Johnny, you want to go first, or you want me to take this one?
Brandon, you go in, and I'll follow.
Yeah. So I'd always kind of been searching for FP&A tools. I was an Excel user, and did the thing that I talked about earlier of, like, hey, I'm going to download all the data out, all my sources, and use my Excel wizardry to sort of show the business everything that needs to be shown. And realizing that doesn't scale all that well, especially as fast as we're growing. And so I always expected or needed this FP&A tool to exist. And Aleph reached out to me a few times, and I get cold emails all the time, and so I deleted them, and then happened to see it in a newsletter that I follow, mostly metrics, and I was like, let me check it out. And I saw their video, and it was kind of like, oh my God, this is too good to be true. This thing that I always wanted exists. And so took a demo and saw it in action. And I'm pretty sure, if I remember correctly, that they actually used some of our data and API'd in for my demo. And I think the sales folks were like, let's catch back up in 2 weeks. And I was like, no, like, can we do this in 2 more days? Because I was so hooked on it. And so I'm pretty sure in a sort of like a trial environment that I was up and moving with Aleph on the next day with our NetSuite data, which was really cool because I think, again, being gun shy a little bit, if you're going to be making a capital investment, like, is this going to work? Is it not? Like, I got to see the day after the demo that my data was in there, and the reports that I was building through Aleph functions and Explorers was the same data that my controller was giving me out of NetSuite. And so implementation, like I said, was instantaneous on NetSuite. Took a day or two longer on some of our other tools, and then we were up and running almost fully functional, I think, within a week, which is an experience that I had not had in other implementations before.
And I would say my experiences were, I think, entirely aligned with that. So I think when it comes to finance, if a product targets, like, a very specific piece of the whole finance workflow, then I think you probably are in a world where there's an onboarding, there's, like, a whole implementation, there's less of a self-serve type aspect because you're really buying that platform to solve for that particular process point. But I think when you come to things like FP&A, it covers so much of the whole context of finance that really, I think the best chance to get traction with finance teams is to do exactly what Aleph has done, which is to create a product that you can get into right away. And let's say, I think to your point there, Brandon, up and running the next day, I think it was almost like, within an hour for me, because I connected a QuickBooks client with Alexa's help, done, you see it. And I mean, I think from a sales standpoint, it's fantastic because you see the value like immediately, and you can sort of translate what you see as that first function to say, okay, well, now I can understand how I can take like a 20-sheet model and I can save myself 15 hours a month. I mean, that was tangible from the first moment you used the product. So I think it's a great sales thing. But it's this kind of self-serve also element, which, you hear a lot of frustrations. And I, like you, Brandon, I'd looked at a lot of FP&A platforms for a while. And I found with various of them, they had this implementation. It was like a period of time before you could actually even get up and running. And then once you were there, it still relied upon their team to come in and do things for you. And so you just had this window into like, oh, I'm not even going to be on my own here. I can't even, delve into the detail, figure out what I'd like to do, etc. So I think the two components, one is being very quick to implement, and then two, having a very self-serve nature, because I think anybody in finance, FP&A, or whatever, we all love being in the weeds. We all love seeing the detail. And a little element that we've kind of touched on throughout is, that finance, like you as a finance person have to understand intimately what's going on, even at the most detailed nature of the business. And so your environment you work in has to allow you to dig right down into it and see it and sort of work in your own way to bring that detail to the top. And so I think in that respect, other platforms they've served certain use cases and industry and business needs. But I think in the world of startups, very high growth companies like Brandon's, we deal in that client base, like you need to evolve. Everything needs to kind of shift week by week, month by month. And you need a very flexible platform for that. I noticed one of the other elements of the question was the kind of training element. And I think that's where there is I think a need because of that flexibility. You do have to, as we have done, the approach we've taken internally is to have various experts who become very knowledgeable in the Aleph platform and act as internal support people for other people using the platform. So that's one way in which you kind of like have layers of support that you can provide out to people. And that's also at the same time as having, I think, this would apply to finance teams in general, having certain tools that you create that kind of are that are kind of like repeatable. So we have standardized reporting, we have standardized financial models for smaller clients. Like once you've got that piece that you can just use and it's like a one button click to go and get it updated, like that kind of thing makes the rollout across other members of the team much simpler as well, because it relies less upon their expertise perhaps, and certainly is a more reliable outcome. So I think in those respects, I think Aleph is killing it. Was that good enough?
Yeah. We'll then like send you your you can send us the bill, Johnny and Brandon. So thanks for that. We'll net 30, which is control cash, but like we'll pay promptly. And I think like not to make it about the left and like just pulling out. I do think that part of having the end user have a lot of power within the platform, even as I am also the buyer of a lot of our tools in our stack, from my CEO role. And I think like, especially now in the age of AI, where like everyone can do more and more, I think like, being able to not rely on someone else and being able to have like the teams that are closer to the action, being like able to do things, I think it's like massive for me as well as a buyer. So that's why we want to make it a part of Aleph, is because that's also how I buy software when I'm out there. So I think we talked a lot about where we are in AI, which is not where we want to be. Let's and we have like maybe like 5 more minutes left, and we'll do a couple of questions. But let's fly into the future, and let's talk not about the today, but the next 2-5 years. What are some of the things that where is AI taking finance? And anyone who wants to start, Brandon, you want to get started?
I can start here. I think that legacy enterprise systems are in a lot of trouble. I think AI native finance apps and platforms are going to be really disruptive. Yeah, I think being AI native from the beginning is going to allow these companies to sort of like keep up and leverage the velocity of the AI evolution. Like even where we are today versus where we were a year ago, it's levels and levels higher. And I think some of these legacy ERPs are going to struggle to try to jam like backward compatible AI driven capabilities into all their existing code bases and architectures and all that kind of stuff. So I think like the ERP as the do it all solution is long gone. I think they're probably going to be maybe like a core GL accounting system because the market trusts in them to perform that. It's a very sacred function to be that that core system from a GL perspective. But all the surrounding operations, reporting, forecasting, invoicing, RevRec, T&E, procurement, like I think they're all ripe for disruption by AI native apps. And so I think finance in the future is going to be much more modular than sort of focused on these one or two tools. And I don't know if we get totally to like the Netflix versus Blockbuster or Sales versus Siebel sort of disruption, but I think a lot of the metrics that these ERPs are trying to drive up, share a wallet and net dollar retention and all that kind of stuff. They're going to have a real struggle with that over the next couple of years as some of these AI native companies come in and eat their lunch.
You're short Oracle. That's the that's the takeaway for those. No investment advice, but like
I won't say that out loud.
Okay.
So I think that the perspective I bring is, well, I think in finance we spend a lot of time making up for not knowing and not having visibility of activity. So, whether that's in completing a close process and judging accruals based upon, what legal expense might be about to, we might get a bill for next month for work that's actually executed this month. Like you're working on rather uninformed assumptions. And so I think, when you look at it, you can imagine with all this agentic AI that's running around right now, that if you gave access to these agents, the different workflows, that might even be things like email, contract, DocuSign, every kind of other platform that a company is using, then you could amass a lot of very relevant information for finance. And that would, I think, in one instance, make a close process more accurate. But I think more importantly, it would inform, particularly short-term forecast assumptions. And I know that, and in fact, I had this directly because I worked with Rocket Money, meaning as a client, Harun Mortazada, and he said it, I think, the best when he said, and we worked with him to develop a financial model that, and the whole process around updating that meant he had great confidence in what was happening 1, 2, 3 months out. And he knew that if he increased like marketing spend this much, that it would translate pretty much reliably to this kind of revenue change or number of users change, et cetera, 1 or 2 months out, because we'd really mapped out the whole thing. And he described it when he had that kind of control over forecast, it meant that the board, when he presented numbers and then either met them or beat them because he presented them carefully and appropriately, then the board trusted him. And so in the boardroom, he had much more control. And they believed in him. So when he suggested like these kind of things is where he thinks the company should go, you're much more likely to get board members sort of acceptance and buy-in. So I think that forecasting piece, if you knew, for example, what work was going on or what kind of email threads were happening with lawyers on contracts or what was happening in sales, like you could be much more accurate in what was going to occur 1, 2, 3, 4 months out. That I think that's feasible within the next 2 to 3 years. I mean, reasonably. And I'd be fascinated to see what kind of ways we bring that information in that kind of helps us create better forecasting and close processes.
Yeah, no, super interesting. And I think it goes back to the way I mentioned, I thinking about it, where what makes you more effective with your board is the fact that you can extract like, one sentence from like one email to make your data better. So it's this idea of, how can you use that, like, those building blocks in the most effective way? Makes a lot of sense. And anything else, any wild, forecasts, like use cases that you wanna, we're in 2025, we'll put this in a box and we'll open it back in like 2030. Where are some of the things that you might say, you know, I cannot believe that we're doing things that way in 2025.
I think about scenario planning, and the way that at least I do scenario planning now. Like you start with your base model, and got a bunch of different inputs and tabs, and then you take that whole model and like you shift it, and you change the one thing in the A/B test, right? And so maybe your marketing spend goes up, and that drives your sales up, and it costs additional spend. Like then you take that model and copy it, and like you're sort of using these independent models. At least that's how we run our scenario planning today, and it's a bear of a task to run that way because you got all these independent models that the ability to do great scenario modeling is only as good as the number of iterations like you can kind of wrap your arms around. And I think I'm excited for a use case that leverages AI to do almost limitless iterations of scenario planning, where again you going back to that point of like you can use natural language models or processing to say like, hey, tweak my marketing spend up 5%, or cut my headcount by 2%, and like you just sort of having these real-time scenario modeling rather than having to run that entire massive model yourself and make the tweaks. And when you're on iteration number 20, you realize you messed something up in iteration 2, and you got to go back through all of that. And so I've had all those pain points, and I love the thought of kind of real-time natural language, almost like we're having conversations with LLM on stuff. Being able to have that with actual real scenarios in your business, has to be a huge game changer for finance.
Nice. And and for me, it's crazy how that's one of the things that feels, for like personally, again, what I know from the LLMs is hard in the next 6 months, inevitable in the next 5 years. And that's what's crazy about this, right? And I think like I was at an OpenAI event like last night, and one of the things that we're talking about, hopefully I'm not saying anything confidential, but one of the things that was very heavy focus is like emphasis on voice agents. So you're mentioning natural language, Brandon. So maybe it's not only just writing to your data, it's just like you talking to your Aleph AI agent that we need to put a name to, and just talking to them, choosing what voice do you want them to have, and like interacting like you would with an actual person in a Zoom call.
Wow.
Yeah, and again, I think 5 years, it's crazy. Johnny, what's one prediction on your end?
So I think one of the a lot of the information that we consume right now is issued or output with the intention of a human being the first consumer of it. So maybe not necessarily like things like bank statements or whatever, but certainly a lot of what we take in finances is information where an expectation is a human's going to read it first. And I think we're going to go to a world where LLMs or the next variant thereof will be the first consumer of information that comes across the board into your company. And so then what you're, as an individual operator in the finance space, what you're then doing is working with those platforms that have pre-sifted, pre-summarized, pre-assessed whatever the information you're getting in. And I think what's going to be interesting is when that information is first provided to you, what does it look like? And I'd mentioned to you guys, there was an interesting tweet I'm getting this predominantly because of Andre Kaparthi, and he mentioned, how software documentation is written right now with the expectation generally that a human's going to read it. And he's like, no, everybody's using LLMs to go and like, tell me about this library, like how do I use the functions, pop it into LLM and say, give me an example. So the LLM is really the one that's parsing through all that text. And so that naturally that text should be written with the expectation that LLM's reading it. And so I wonder, that really is an open question. I don't know quite what that means then for finance, but in terms of the way that we work with products. I think that's probably the key. That's the key thing that occurs as to how it could evolve.
Yeah. Adam is putting a question out there of where we should name our AI agent Albert. It will be very confusing. So we have a Alexa in our sales team, and that's already confusing enough. I need to change the setting of my devices at home. So like I don't want like every time someone says Albert to like the Aleph AI to start blinking. So do me a favor and both know there I will campaign for the no. And
Actually, sorry, just on that with the voice thing, I think that certainly my interpretation is that in finance you have to become, you have to have picked up a real intimate knowledge for where the company's at and where the important levers are and where, be able to answer questions quickly and easily as to the details. But you have to have built this kind of mental model around the business and how it's working and what's going to make it change, and really how that kind of informs your forecasting model. And that's the piece where I wonder about AI's utility in, things like variance analysis, where it just spits out a whole bunch of information at you. You're like, well, it's not really, I'm missing the piece that's important, which is me actually spending time going in there, seeing for myself, like, here's actually what happened, and kind of making the linkages in your head. And I think there's a danger where it's not really so much about validity, it's about actually skipping over what's important, which is building that comprehension. And so that's maybe one of the danger pieces, I think, in assuming, I think, as Brandon, you mentioned before, too much utility. Like, the dangers of using AI too much is we actually skip over what's important, which is building that mental model of your business. And I don't know where AI kind of really solves that for us, in all honesty, even with voice and whatever.
No, I think it's, sometimes we know in LF we push a lot of automation, and this, you shouldn't be copy pasting, and sometimes one of the pushbacks is I like to copy paste from QuickBooks, because as I'm copy pasting, I'm like reading the data and I'm seeing what it means, and there's part of it that I'm like, there's other ways to do that, but there's part that is like, you need to find ways. Like in my head, it's more, you need to find ways to replace those workflows and achieve those without doing, how can you not do the menial part and do the value added part of, you do need to dig into the variances and understand what's going on. I want to make sure we have like 3 questions from the audience. Want to make sure that we have to cover a few of those, and a couple more that might come. So I maybe start with you, Brandon. You were bearish on Oracle. There's a question that is, do we think Microsoft and Google will figure out, Office embedded AI solutions, and on what timeline? And then I can take the left side of the answer there, the second part of the question.
I think they will, and it's going to work, I think, probably in the same frameworks that it is today. And so, do I think that they're going to be APIing into all different sorts of data and becoming like this financial ERP system or tool? Yeah, probably not. But I think they're absolutely going to be figuring out, particularly those 2 companies, Microsoft and Google, being in the OpenAI and other spaces. Like, they're going to figure this out and figure out how to be put into their core platforms. Now, at the same time, I also think that they'll be much more focused where the greatest leverage is for them. That's probably in the advertising and some of the big money makers. And so I don't know if improving Microsoft Word is going to be at the top of Microsoft's AI checklist. But they're certainly going to be able to implement AI into their tools natively.
There was a second part of the question around like how we at LF think about AI solutions to build versus what we'll wait for Excel and Sheets. And I think I have like 2 parts of the answer. The first one is, if there's a problem that is important and worth solving and everything will add a lot of value, I wouldn't wait, because we think that we can move a couple orders of magnitude faster than a company like Microsoft and Google. But I think the other side is the fact that LF integrates with Excel and Google Sheets and is not trying to rebuild the spreadsheet, is that everything they would do will make like LF users' lives easier. And I think a lot of the value for us is just connecting the dots and making things work well all together, rather than necessarily like solving one part that might be the spreadsheet. So every time the Google Sheets API gets faster, which has happened a couple of times in the last few years, LF gets faster and our customers are happier. And I think I see it similar with AI. We have one around like beyond reading data, AI, there's a lot of potential to helping us like spot patterns and risks. what tools or platforms should we be looking at to get ahead of this trend? And Aleph, so Luis is asking that. Aleph can do some of that. So I will do it like outside. I will ban Aleph from the answer, Brandon and Johnny. And like, are there other companies that are not Aleph that you think and you've seen could be interesting for things like that?
You know, I don't know if there's anything. I mean, we've obviously looked at a lot of platforms, and I don't know if anything rises to the top in terms of that trend analysis. No, I don't think there's anybody I'd highlight particularly. I think, you know, because I can see, yeah, of course, the utility being able to spot things from a massive data. Yeah, I'm not sure. I don't think anything's going to pop to the top on that one. I think people are obviously looking at it. There's a lot of sort of, you know, analytics, like the office of the CFO is getting huge attention. There's a lot out there. But you know, again, it goes back to like the AI utility right now, I think is in this sort of task automation at the more sort of informational level that's kind of like just, you know, connecting the dots more easily and more quickly than we would otherwise do ourselves. And it's not really, yeah, I'm sorry, I'm just answering the question there. I don't think there isn't anything I would highlight very clearly.
Brandon, anything to highlight on your end? Anything that comes to mind, or maybe?
Yeah, I'm sort of in the same spot as Johnny. I haven't seen a tool that does that in particular. I love Johnny's thought of like knowing your business inside and out and all the data points. Like that's super critical. And so with that, with existing, you know, even LLMs or, you know, some of the early stage AI tools, like you can put guardrails in place and sort of teach AI, like, you know, what should you be looking out for and what are the guardrails, and, you know, anything over this limit or that has this sort of flag, you know, spot it for me. But yeah, nothing that I think has that automated workflow in place right now in financial reporting or, you know, data ingestion.
We'll implement it with you all in the next LF session, and it will be a topic of webinar number 2. And that's close to time, so I know, you know, we want to try and finish promptly. I have my Latin blood, so I always, you know, on time for me might be 1-2 minutes late. But it is, you know, 1-2 minutes past the hour. So thanks so much, Brandon. Thanks so much, Johnny, for taking the time and speaking with us. And yeah, thank you all on the other side, you know, putting up with us 3 for an entire hour.
That's fun. Thanks, Albert. Good to see you, Johnny.
Thanks. Yeah, very good to see you guys too. Thank you very much. That was great.
Hey guys,
Bye.
thanks.